It's a great pleasure to be with you all tonight and to introduce this session. When we thought as a department about the month of June and highlighting Juneteenth, I was really pleased to be able to collaborate with Anika Farrell and Shantika O'Farrow from the Renton School District in Washington State, and also with David Coleman. He's a senior policy analyst in the NEA Human and Civil Rights Department within the Center for Social Justice. And we really thought that what would be so impactful would be to really kind of do a deep dive into the history of Juneteenth, and then also talk about, well, so what's the relevancy about Juneteenth to us today? And given the social uprisings, the awakening that this nation has really come towards in the last year or so, we thought that highlighting a state, an affiliate that really has invested in working towards education-based solutions to actually making that change happen, moving from the policy ideas to the actual local supports and local needs to change implicit biases and think through those issues was a great way to start off. So I just want to welcome you all and just want us to get started. And David's going to launch us off with some background on Juneteenth. So David?
Yes, hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. The first, turn my camera for you all. Hello, everyone. The first thing I wanted to do was set the scene and stage for how Juneteenth came about. And in 1860, when President Abraham was elected, a Republican president with very liberal views, plantation owners really believed that they needed to secede from the Union because of those views, because they believed he was going to end slavery. As a result of failed peace talks, 11 states actually seceded from the Union. This led to the Civil War. During the war, Lincoln refused to end slavery. I think that's important to note, but threatened to end slavery as a tactic in order to end the war. After 3 years of war and several failed battles, and with limited troops as well, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. So just 3 years into his presidency, he was forced to end slavery to allow African-American troops to join the forces of the Union to fight against the South. Next slide. So the Emancipation Proclamation, and I want to make sure that I read this for your hearing. My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and it's not either to save or to destroy slavery, Lincoln wrote. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save this Union. So Lincoln's charge was not to end slavery for people of color, but to save the Union in and of itself. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a political tactic that was used for military force against the Confederacy, and to fight for the Union and gave whites things to fight for, and as well as finance. So it ended slavery in the Confederate States, but not necessarily in all the Union states. So Blacks, specifically in Texas, were not notified of the Emancipation Proclamation because of its proximity to the Union and how deep in the South it was located. Next slide. So this led in April of 1864 to United States passing the proposed amendment to actually ban slavery. So still at this time, even though the Emancipation Proclamation was passed and the 13th Amendment was adopted, the people in Texas still did not know that they were free. And on January 31st, representatives passed the proposed amendment. And the amendment says this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime wherefore the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. But it's important to note that the 13th Amendment was not ratified until December 6th of that year. So this leads us to General Order number 3. And the purpose of General Order number 3 was specifically for the people of Texas. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection thereof, therefore existing between them, becomes that between employer and hired labor, and which led to indentured servitude. The General Order number 3 was read on June 19th in 1865, which was 5 years after President Lincoln was elected president, and over 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law, and over a year after the 13th Amendment was also put into law. A celebration after the June 19th was ensued after the General read Order number 3, and the celebration has lasted now for over 150 years. That celebration is called Juneteenth. And as we all know, the president has recently signed into law that Juneteenth will be a federal holiday, and we will be celebrating that holiday tomorrow on June 18th.
I'm going to try and get us through. David's gone through most of the content. The celebration lasted for over 150 years, and it's come to us as Juneteenth. David, are you trying to? Yeah, we can't hear you. I think it's probably best if you mute. So Juneteenth originated in Galveston, Texas in 1865. Galveston was the last stronghold of the laws, and considered the African American Emancipation Day. It's celebrated by some as a day, a week, and in some areas a month. And Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the end of slavery in the United States. So really, when we think about Juneteenth, it does have this very antiquated connection, right? It is based in the Civil War. That is where it comes from. It comes from the Emancipation Day, and really seems very distant from our current reality until now in a lot of ways, especially given the fact that President Biden just signed into law this day of celebration that has really stayed within the African American community. More of our society is really trying to understand and more about this special, important day and its meaning for the Black community. And now, as a federal holiday, has such a important role. We really need to be educating one another about this and thinking about how we move from policies into practice, right? How we move from uprisings and the idea of creating greater social awareness and community, and then actually taking steps to do so, which is incredibly hard work. So, in thinking about Juneteenth's relevancy today, we really wanted to highlight a state affiliate, the Washington Education Association, and its members who are working very hard to actually unravel biases, work through the racial and social injustices, and educate their members to make the change that we all want to see in the world. So Anika Farrell is a member of the Washington Education Association. She works in the Renton School District, and she has really taken a leading role in the leadership of this content, the trainings that have been developed, and she's going to share kind of all of that background with us today so that you can take something back to your local, take something back to your school, and maybe start some conversations about how to apply these strategies. Anika?
Thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate the introduction, and I absolutely appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about being able to, make justice a priority for all of us. We're talking about Juneteenth being a national federal holiday, and that's great to be able to recognize that. However, it's important for us to understand what impacts our ability to truly see that implemented. And so it's important for us to understand what it is that racial and social justice means so that we can look at what doesn't happen in order to unlearn some of those behaviors, to recraft the way that we can make and create environments and cultures that would allow for us to truly have a just society where we not only just have a holiday, but we have it embedded into the culture in which we live. So, what is racial justice? Racial justice is defined as the systematic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. Now that sounds good, right? Everyone is allowed fair, systematic treatment, no matter what race you are, and you have equitable opportunity and outcomes. However, we know by looking at the news and society that oftentimes people of color, Black people specifically, don't have those same opportunities. When we look at policing in the communities of color, when we look at the way that our Black men and women are treated when they are, in their own communities, how they're over policed within those communities. Those types of situations and examples are racial injustices that are happening within our communities. Whereas we need to create a way that we can help to educate individuals so that they understand what's happening, why it's happening, and the impact that they need to take to change those narratives. When we look at our schools within our Black and Brown communities, we look at some of those schools that have some of the newest teachers getting some of the less education that they can get because some of those new teachers are just starting. And then we look at the test scores and some of the outcomes that those students have. And we have to understand those are not equitable opportunities and outcomes when you're talking about systematic fair treatment. Now, if we take a look at what social justice is, we're defining that as the fair treatment of all people in society, including respect for the rights of minorities and equitable distribution of resources among members of the community, right? That's what social justice is. But what we find is that social justice doesn't come out that way for Black people and people of color. I did some research on the CDC's website. And what I found and what researchers identified is that they analyzed data across the country and in some large cities looking at the number of confirmed cases and deaths based on race and ethnicity and related factors. And what they found was that African Americans and Latino and Hispanic populations had disproportionate higher rates of hospitalizations due to COVID than any other group. Why is that? Education isn't available to them always. They're not diagnosed in the same way that the white majority is. And so when we think about social justice in our communities and for Black people specifically, we see that the data supports that there are social injustices that are occurring. So while we know what racial justice is and what social justice is, we have to think about what it is not for people of color, Black people specifically. Now, racial and social justice is impacted by implicit biases. What is implicit bias, you might say? Well, implicit bias is the unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that we have towards people of color, right? That is what that is. It's the unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that we have towards people of color. So what happens is when you have an individual like myself or a peer of mine who is Black going into a hospital and saying, I'm feeling this kind of way. I feel like I'm coughing. I think I have a fever. And then the diagnosis or the attention that they get is very different than maybe their white counterpart would get. So that guess what? The diagnoses might be different because there's an assumption about who people are. or what they do or how they're perceived. And that comes from research shows starting around the age of 3, we develop what we call implicit bias. And that comes from our peers, that comes from our communities, TV, social media, all of those things impact the way that we see individuals. That impacts the way that we respond to them, the way we give them fair treatment as part of the social justice method, or the way that we evaluate racial justice that goes far beyond anti-racism. So when we think about implicit bias and making justice a priority, we have to be able to check ourselves, right? We have to be able to check ourselves and evaluate who we are in order to recognize that we have a bias in the first place. So that's how this thing got started in Washington State. We saw the unrest of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. I am personally from Louisville, Kentucky, so I know exactly the community and that she lives in and the ideologies and the way people see individuals within my state. But I knew from talking with peers, friends, family members, that it was important for us to continue and push the work forward to help people recognize that their biases impacted the way that they treat people, the way that they respond to people. So COVID happened, right? COVID happened. We left March 20th of 2020. We were told to take our computers, go home, and then we didn't know what was happening next. Well, people still needed to be educated during this time. No, we could not have face-to-face meetings. No, we could not be a collective in a room, but what we could do is still provide the necessary fundamental information that educators needed specifically to train and relearn and unlearn what they had known to show up different. Because what happens is educators are in the classroom. Educators are with our babies. They are providing a space that is supposed to be safe for all, but it didn't always feel that way. So the implicit bias cadre began doing virtual trainings last June 2020. And so myself and the statewide event coordinator, Jill Dolan, we were like, okay, so people need this information. People have to have this information. What do we do? So we started providing the trainings every week, okay? We started getting wait lists of 100, 200 people at a time because people in these communities, educators specifically, knew what they saw on TV wasn't right and were willing and wanting to say, you know what? I need to show up and be better. I need to show up and do better. And so the interest continued to spiral. I mean, every time we had a training, it was a wait list of like 100 to 200 people. So what did we do? We started doing them like every day because guess what? The summer was coming. People were out of school. People wanted this knowledge. It was COVID. We couldn't go anywhere. So that's what we did. We began to have other trainers who were saying, you know what? I think I'm a little comfortable with doing Zoom. Zoom isn't scary to me anymore because by this time months had passed. And we were able to then connect with people from all over the state of Washington and provide them with the necessary tools that they needed to be able to what? Learn about the implicit biases they had, the words that, yeah, seemed like they were new, but really weren't. But what people had to realize and what they had to learn is that they had them. Everybody had them. And oftentimes those trainings began and people were like, but I don't want to feel like I'm a racist. Well, you might not want to feel like you're a racist, but what you need to do is first recognize that you have a bias, period, that impacts the way you see, respond, and or react to people of color. The data shows that. So the trainings took place. We were moving, we were grooving, they were happening every day. We were doing it. And I'm trying to advance my screen, but that's not happening. And I'm not really sure why, but there we go. And so we saw the vast want and desire. I mean, literally associations were contacting us saying, yes, we see this work you're doing. Yes, we hear that these trainings are working. Yes, people are beginning to think. People are beginning to come into these spaces 25, 30 at a time and say, look, I did not recognize that I had this until this was brought to my attention. So then it just kind of went viral. We began to see the need to make and create trainings that not just address the introduction of this information, but what could we do to move this work and continue this work? Because keep in mind, implicit bias doesn't stop. Implicit bias must be continued to be unlearned because those old behaviors creep up and we have to check ourselves. We have to check what we say. We have to check what we do. We have to check how we respond. So it was a requirement that we actually continue this work and move this work forward. We worked with education service districts. We worked directly with school districts. We worked with schools independently. We worked with other associations. And literally, we were training thousands of people because the Washington Education Association has thousands of people. It was necessary that as those thousands of people were being trained, that we also provided them with new substantive information, things that allowed for them to interrupt the discrimination that they saw that was existing that comes through implicit bias. So we began to talk about what does that look like? I had wrote a restorative justice training maybe a year before we were able to further develop it. And the restorative justice training related to improving student outcomes, ways that we could build within our educational structures, an opportunity for educators to do something different, not rely on just punitive harms towards students of color, because I look at the research and I see that students of color, Black boys specifically, are being suspended, expelled, and all of these things more than any other group. And so it was time to look at ways in which we could restore the practice. So we identify implicit bias is an occurrence. We identify what implicit bias is. You check yourself, you evaluate who you are. Then let's move to our steps of trying to change the narrative, trying to not just change who you are, the way you think, but the way you practice. So what we did is we had an opportunity to further develop the restorative justice training that I had created with a team. And then that team not only revamped that and developed that, we began to work on other training, race and ethnicity, moving beyond just your implicit bias. We worked hard to develop and provide trainings that could change the narrative. We know that harms are caused by expulsions, extensions, suspensions, especially to our students of color. So what do? We need to build intentional relationships that allow for us to connect with students with an authentic lens that allows us to address being able to change our mindsets in the way that we approach discipline, because guess what? We're approaching it that way because our implicit biases and our stereotypes and assumptions lead us to do so. So we looked at restorative justice as an ability to emphasize the accountability of students, to build a culture for students, to allow them to be part of that narrative, be part of that communication that's taking place, and changing the way the data shows that there's these high suspension and expulsion rates of students of color, Black boys specifically, than any other group. And it allows for us to build community within classrooms and within peer groups. And so although we're doing that, although we're having you address implicit bias, although we're building new trainings and trying to provide restorative justice practices within our educational systems, what we're doing is providing another way to do what we should be doing, which is allowing a space that is safe for everybody. And it doesn't mean that our restorative justice process and trainings and development takes away the consequence of an action, but what it does is it allows us to build a relationship with the student that changes the nature of the consequence. And that's the important part. Because when you can build a relationship with a student and you can change the way that student feels about you and feels about a situation, and they know it's truly intentional, then you have an improvement in the whole culture of that educational environment. And that starts first with checking your implicit bias and what that looks like, and then evaluating that within yourself, completing trainings that help you to continue to unlearn those habits and to address it ongoingly so that you show up different each and every day. So I thought about, okay, we're doing all of these trainings. It's working. People are coming back. They're telling me specifically, I had a lady tell me last night, she said, Anika, these trainings are hard for me as a white woman. She said, but I connect with what you're saying because you're challenging me to do so. But I can receive it from you. I can hear it from you. And I've come back 5 and 6 times over because it doesn't feel good to feel the way I'm feeling, but I know I got to sit in it like you tell me. Experience that discomfort because it's part of the process. But it doesn't stop with just training, right? We train, we're doing it virtually. There is an opportunity, maybe once we go back, to do it in person again, but not yet. But as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about how do we make this part of the culture of the Washington Education Association? How do we develop something that goes beyond the trainings that we've been doing for a year and makes it part of the culture that we have? So I worked with one of my colleagues on resolutions. And we talked about it, and then, COVID happened because we were in person, and it was time for the Washington Education Representative Assembly. And I thought about, what do I want to do for my part of this work? And I knew that a resolution to the association created, presented, and was passed by them, but it was only a philosophy. So I created a resolution for the Washington Education Representative Assembly, thinking I want this to be a philosophy of the Education Association that I'm a part of. I want this to be part of the ongoing process. So when people look at whatever, papers or data or book or our computer system, they see that this is a philosophy that this Education Association has. And maybe it's because I brought it to the forefront, but it's because the members passed overwhelmingly this philosophy, this resolution that is now part of the Washington Education Association. So it wasn't just about doing a training. It wasn't just about training thousands of people. It wasn't just about, having the next level of training materials, but it was about making this embedded in the culture. And the Washington Education Association members did a due pass of the resolution overwhelmingly. I wanted to cry. They couldn't see me, but I wanted to, because I felt like members were also committed to changing the dynamic and were committed to making this part of the philosophy of the association. But guess what? A philosophy is a philosophy, right? It doesn't do anything without money behind it. It doesn't do anything without a budget behind it. So I'm thinking, okay, I know what a resolution is and I know what a resolution does. But now how do I get funding that allows for me to continue to do this with my cadre members and this implicit bias team in a way that is substantive for our members across the state? So I sat and wrote this new business item, AKA an MBI. And I thought about, okay, this right here is going to provide substance to that resolution. This is going to go to the board, have them evaluated, and then provide money as part of that budgeting process that will then go to members for consideration. Also, as part of the Washington Education Association Representative Assembly. That went to the Representative Assembly, and it had another due pass, overwhelmingly supported by the members of the association, who were also committed to the work that we're doing in this cadre. So it wasn't about just an idea that I had about a resolution. And that idea came from some work that I did with another cadre member. That I was like, you know what, let me develop this a little bit more. Let me put this into play. But it also comes with money to help support this work. So with that new business item that was passed during the Representative Assembly, now we have a budget that can be allowed to address the true, intentional, authentic way that we help to educate educators across the state of Washington around implicit bias. And the importance that it has for our Black and Brown students specifically, but not just only, because when all of our educators and students are educated, we have a successful culture where everyone can thrive. But we have to be able to evaluate the ways in which educators understand and see that. So the resolution passed, the new business item passed, and then here we are, investing in the support. We're investing in the support because research shows that if we don't, we have, as part of what happens in this little piece in our brain called the amygdala, it begins to develop the way we see people, the way we stereotype people, the way we address situations. That is the way we begin to build negative attitudes. That transfers to implicit racial bias, typically towards people of color, because those are the people that are seen in media and print TV and books to have done things that look so different than their white counterparts, because it's shown that way. Not because it's true, but because it's shown that way. That leads to individuals stereotyping people of color. That then leads to the way they're discriminated against, whether it's through not being provided access to resources, whether that means being treated differently within their educational environment by not having access to the same opportunities as their white counterparts, which then leads to the inequities and injustices that exist, and that cycle continues. So the work that we're doing in Washington State, it started out work that we needed to do because we saw this Black Lives Matter movement and all of the things that were happening in society as a need to educate our educators so that when they walk into their classrooms and educational spaces, they could change the narrative of the way they saw their students and their families and their peers, but also so that it would have sustainable and systematic outcomes for everybody. So it's important for us to care about this because we have to retrain our brains to unlearn a cycled system that continues sometimes to be embedded in that little place called the amygdala in our brain that begins to shape the way that we see these things. So we think about reshaping, understanding, and creating a culture. We're creating a culture that allows educators to be more comfortable with concepts around implicit, some people call it unconscious bias, in their educational spaces and cultural competency. That's what we want. We want people to be so comfortable with talking about these concepts that it doesn't require a response, but I'm not racist. Why does it sound like I'm racist? I don't want to be identified that way. Well, we want conversations to create, in this culture that we're trying to develop, to where that's not the response, because you're sitting in that discomfort in order to be able to listen, not to respond, but to understand. And we're creating a culture where we want to recognize the importance of understanding that the culture and the atmospheres in schools are directly linked to student success. We want these trainings that we're doing, and for educators who are learning and getting the information to understand and recognize the importance of creating a culture and an atmosphere where students can feel safe, not safe necessarily from harm from someone, but safe in their mental capacity, safe in their emotional capacity, so that they don't have to continue to sit in the trauma that tends to exist within educational environments that weren't built for us in the first place. We're creating a culture that allows for us to understand how systems and environments are successful and thrive when they acknowledge there are biases and stereotypes of various groups that exist, which impact the way that they see students, they see families, they see peers, and anyone else in the outside world. When we can provide trainings that allow for us to create a culture that does that, we are creating success. We are creating success for not only just the educators to recognize their biases, but to understand the importance for students, the outcomes that students have as a result of that. We are in our educational environments for student success, not just for white student success, but for all student success, Black and brown alike. That's what we're here for. And so if our training can help advance that and create cultures where we can be comfortable with these conversations, where we can sit in that discomfort and listen to understand the information and not just respond to it, where we can recognize the importance of understanding that the culture and atmospheres in schools is directly related to the success of students so that all students can thrive. And we can understand how those systems and environments are successful when we acknowledge that we have biases, because that's the first part, acknowledging that something exists. Something exists that prevents me from showing up and being my best self for every student in the classroom. That's the creating of a culture that we are trying to provide through the trainings that are being done. So, making a long-term investment that benefits all. The Washington Education Association addresses the continued need to identify disparate impact and disproportionality in education outcomes towards marginalized groups and people of color. It is allowing us to continue to provide training. Our members have overwhelmingly supported the work. It's not just us. It's about the members who believe that this work is also important. It's also a collective process so that we can address the continued need. The disparate impacts that people of color, Black people specifically, have and the disproportionality that they have in educational outcomes doesn't stop overnight. It doesn't end with the blink of an eye because Anika has trained thousands of people. No. It doesn't happen like that. We have to continue to embed in the work that we do as an association the long-term investment that benefits our members, which is what they did at the Representative Assembly. By overwhelmingly passing resolutions and new business items that supported this work. We want to be able to provide trainings to members that will support their professional development and growth. We should always be learning as educators. I tell my participants who come to my trainings all the time, learning should never stop. It should always be an ongoing process that we, cannot, not do. Professional development and growth should be something that you are doing ongoingly because it's part of a process that you need in order to thrive, right? You should want to thrive with information. You should want to grow with information and understand it in a place that helps you to be a better person, not just for yourself, but those students and families and peers and communities that are impacted by you. Because we know that when people learn and grow and understand themselves, the impact that they have on the success of students of color, their communities and peers can be overwhelmingly changed to improve. And so therefore, the long-term investment that we have is wanting to make sure that we continue this work so it continues to grow, so that we can continue to impact educators in a powerful and substantive way. Washington Education Association has afforded me the opportunity to be a trainer, to be in front of its members, to be a part of a culture where I feel like I can make a difference as an individual. But I also realize too that I have biases that I have to check myself all the time. And so when I'm in my trainings and I'm starting them off, I'm like, let me just tell everybody, we all have biases. Implicit bias is part of who we are. We just got to continue to unlearn it. And as we continue to unlearn it, then we continue to grow in ourselves. And the importance of this and the relevance of this as it relates to Juneteenth is that this was a freedom day, but what does freedom really look like? Do people of color, Black people specifically, truly feel free in this culture and environment and space that we occupy right now? No, we don't. There's things that we want to change. There's things that we want to see done. And yes, it is wonderful that a federal and national holiday is going to be part of Juneteenth, but I want to see racial and social justice and equity present in that day. I want to see people who look like me and my children and my friends and my family not have to worry about the same things that they had to worry about in 1865. That's the importance of this work. And that's why we should care enough about it to be able to continue this work and share it with others. So when I was allowed the opportunity to be a part of this space and share how others can do this work, I thought, well, other associations can work within their associations, maybe to talk with their leaders or talk with their locals about developing teams of trainers who can sit down, develop content, and think about the true, intentional, and authentic way in which it can be done. And that doesn't mean just white educators. That means diverse educators who can be part of the process and be part of the outcomes, because they play an intricate part in the outcomes that are happening with Black and Brown students. So we don't want teams that are just white. Our implicit bias team encompasses all facets of diversity. It's like a salad bowl, and it should be, because it all has its own crunch. We're all different. And you should be able to develop that team, create a diverse cadre of members, begin to look at curriculum that can be built. Now, have you reached out? Have you thought about resolutions for your own associations? Have you thought about new business items that would then provide resources and budget towards that? If not, consider those things too. We all have representative assemblies. We all have things that we're doing. But guess what? We can't do it alone. We have to do it with the collective of a team, but that team should be a diverse team that can provide substance, that can provide the information and the intentionality that it deserves. And then you can watch it thrive. I never would have thought when I started doing these trainings in June that it would have taken me to the places and to the people that I've been able to connect with, but it has. And this work brings me so much joy, and it should bring you that kind of joy. Because that's what makes it work. That's what makes it thrive. That's what makes it exactly what it should be. And so as we talk about how you can do this work, and I love the fact that my advance button isn't like advancing like I'd like it to. But I'm going to have an individual who is also an educational support professional. Shantaks Story, she's a substitute specialist in the Renton School District. She is also a Washington Education Association member. She's going to speak to the importance that it has had on her specifically. And so I'm trying to go back to the other slide, but I'm going to turn this over to you, Shantika.
Thank you everyone for being here. As Anika stated, my name is Shantika Farrow. And so before I get started on the importance of this work, I will give you a little bit of background on my experience as it plays when I was as I'm working in the Renton School District and how I got started on the training. So one of my initial quotes from Martin Luther King is, "The time is always right to do what is right." And from that, I would say when I started in Renton about 8.5 years ago, it's been a long time, I started off as a receptionist and everything was going well, I would say, and then I was like, people started to say things and started to do things. And at the time, I didn't know what like implicit biases was and microaggressions. I just knew how it made me feel. And it just didn't feel right. It just didn't sit well with me. And so as time went on, I was like, I don't think people are supposed to be saying this. For instance, people would first like talk about the way that I would speak. They were like, oh, like her tone is like very harsh, very abrasive. And the way that I'm speaking to you all is the way that I speak all the time. My tone does not change. It's like this all the time. I cannot change it. The only time it is heightened is if I'm like yelling at my child and telling her to stop doing something. And you should all know, if you have kids out there, we're always constantly saying, no, don't do this, don't touch this. There was an incident one point in time with my classified manager. We had students that would come in and like went on the job training when I was working as the receptionist. I had about like 4 students that I would train, letting them know exactly how the receptionist and front desk works. Out of the 4 students, one of the students, she did not want to follow directions. She was like, you know, doing her own thing. And I would have conversations with her and say, hey, can you just make sure you're doing this right? And this had became like a pattern with her. So I tried to address it several times. And then I was like, you know what, like, I'm not getting anywhere with her. Let me tell my classified manager. So I let my classified manager know, like, hey, this is what's going on with her. So she was like, well, what did you say? And I was like, I told her what I said to her. She was like, well, maybe it's the way that you said it. Like, it was your tone, you know, you sound like you have an attitude, you're just very abrasive. And I'm looking at her like, what? And I have no poker face whatsoever. So inside my head, I'm thinking like, what the heck? And my face probably says it all. And I'm like telling her like, no, because all the other students are doing what I'm asking. She's the only person that is not. And instead of putting the onus back on the student, she put it back on me. And so it was like no accountability whatsoever. And then it's like a deflection. And then as time went on, I had got pregnant while I was working there. And there was times that I brought my baby in, my daughter at the time, and automatically when I brought her in, people wanted to touch her hair. And it's like, oh my gosh, I can't. 1, I did not give you permission to touch my daughter's hair. 2, I'm thinking like, why are you in a person's face? She's a newborn. Why are you doing that? People will also make comments about like her hair, and it's like when they touched it, they would just like reach out and grab it and touch it and be like, oh my God, it's so soft. And it's like, well, how else is hair supposed to be? Isn't all hair soft unless you're like bald? There also has been times where people have just come up to me. I would talk to like somebody randomly in the hallway and we're talking about hair, because I've had to wear different protective styles in my hair, braids, natural hair, and they'll be like, oh, just start touching my hair randomly. And I'm thinking like, I'm just caught off guard. And I'm like, what are you doing? and they just have nothing to say. Like, I'm just supposed to be okay with it. It's an okay thing. And it's like, no, it's not. There's also been times I've seen people have getting me mixed up with other Black people. When Anika has come on board, when I met her at the district office, I mean, automatically, instantly, because our names are very similar, they've gotten us confused or put our names together, and I'm like, what the heck? Like, just because our names are very similar doesn't mean that you guys could confuse us. And it's like you're saying that Black people are monoliths, and you don't see us as individual people, which is not fair to us. There's also been times that people have come up and made even compliments, which they would call them compliments, about my child, and will be like, oh, she's so beautiful because she's Black, as to say as if Black people are not beautiful. And it's like, that's not a compliment, because the moment that you put race in it, that removes the compliment. There's also been times too that I've seen just the way people that are in power or have privilege because of their title. Admin will feel like if you tell them how a process or something goes, they do not like it. Like, who am I to tell them I'm just a specialist? You shouldn't be speaking to me like that. And it's like, I'm just letting you know how this process is supposed to go, not that I'm trying to disrespect you in any kind of way. But it becomes that hierarchy that it's just unfair. It's just like, it never felt right to me. It just made me feel, one, invisible, two, like I'm being disrespected and not valued as an employee of the district, and then as a human, as a Black woman. And it's like, I've never disrespected anybody there, so why are they coming at me like this? And so when I met Anika, and she was the one that was telling me about the trainings that was going on with WPA, I was like, okay, because I really wanted to know more about like implicit biases and the microaggressions. And so when I got started, I was like, okay, like, this is exactly what has been going on, what has been said, what has been transpiring, and it just made me feel like I could let this burden release. And also, when I was explaining to Anita my experiences, it made me feel validated, because it's like I had another person of color to go to. There has been other people of color at the job, but I don't think they grasped it and are felt vulnerable enough to speak up. And they seem to always end up leaving. They didn't feel like they had a voice, and I understand that. Because a lot of the times I know for me, when I started to defend myself, I got the scapegoat and got she's becoming the angry Black girl. Like, why is she doing that? And it's like, no, I have every right to defend myself and let you know how I'm feeling without you putting a label on it. That is not fair to me. And so, like I said, when going to the training and hearing about the implicit biases and microaggressions, first and foremost, I was like, okay, like, I get it. And then also it had made me have a better understanding as to where they were coming from, because everybody needs to learn and everybody needs to grow. And you have to leave room and leave it open for white people to understand that stuff is rooted in white supremacy. And I don't think they really understand that sometimes. And two, it's also the way that you was raised and the culture that you was raised in. When you are white and don't have friends that look different than you, then obviously you're going to say things unconsciously without even knowing. And so you have to let people ask questions. And I think now, if they are open and willing and wanting to go to these types of trainings, because I've been to the implicit bias one, the race and ethnicity, the 2.0, the implicit bias, and then also the restorative justice, they have to be able to sit with their discomfort. It needs to be, they need to start being comfortable with being uncomfortable, I would say. So that way, instead of you automatically being like, oh, I'm gonna get defensive. Because I found that a lot of the time, sometimes when I'm in those trainings, they'll get defensive and want to hear in order to respond. And instead of you sit there in that discomfort and then listen to understand. And even for people of color too. I mean, it's nice to see white people that want to come and learn, but also I think a lot of the time, Black people specifically would need to come more, just so that their voices are heard and to be validated in their experiences, because everybody needs to sit at that table. White people can't understand where we're coming from if we're not able to sit there and let our voices be heard. And then also, I would say, once you start to do the work, there's going to be a time when you're going to have to start doing like a self-reflection. And then you'll have a better understanding of holding yourself accountable to hold other people accountable for their actions and behavior. But you can't do that unless you start to do the trainings and do the work. And because there's always going to be a time for you to mitigate, disrupt, and dismantle any social inequities that you see, especially in this institution in education. It's very difficult when it's always the burden is put on Black people or any person of color to always speak up when white people see things happening, but then also too, you can't speak up on something when you act as if something does not exist and you're benefiting from that. So just make sure that you are doing the work, and as I stated before, too, the time is always right to do what is right, and the time is right now to make sure that you want to get out there and not only become an ally, but to become an accomplice too as well. Because you don't want, if you have children, you don't want your children to continue on this pattern that we have seen throughout history. I know for me as a mother, I do not want my child to have to continue this and be subjected to these types of inequities because it's not fair to her. Like, and it wasn't fair to us or our grandparents to have to continue on this. And it's the reason why history keeps repeating itself, because we have not changed, and we need to all come together in order to move the bar in order to change it. So I want to thank you guys for your time.
So what's next for us as a education association, as Washington Education Association, and as a trainer, is to continue to expand this work so that voices and people like Shantika and other educators are able to be used, heard, experienced, to make opportunities available to this work to educators across the United States. Right now, I've had the wonderful opportunity of taking part in providing trainings for the National Education Association's Education Support Professional Conference. That was a wonderful opportunity to connect with educators across the US who were wanting information and desiring information that could help them move this work forward. Using platforms to up uplift the understanding of this training and the importance of the training and the knowledge that is required to do and just execute it. And to be able to have it done and implemented within not just my state, but even in your states, wherever you are. So that is our steps, is to continue to do that work and to expand that work and to have opportunities like these that the National Education Association is affording us, to be a voice, to speak on it, to share about it, and then to provide resources like you will have available to you. Individuals like the Kerwin Institute is doing research. RacialEquityTools.org is doing research. We are learning about this information. You're hearing the word implicit bias probably more than you've ever heard it, because it impacts who and what we are. It impacts us specifically and individually. And so once we check ourselves, then we can begin moving forward on this journey and continuing to move forward on this journey that we call equity. Now, my suggestion, a lot of times people say, oh, well, what do I need to do, or what can I think about as I consider these other resources and books that I would consider? And one that I highlighted was Biased and Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do by Jennifer Eberhardt. Great book. Something that allows you to really assess from a personal perspective what that looks like for her in her experience, which helped her to understand how you don't even realize sometimes when you don't see color, how you see color and how that is shaped through the biases that you have, or implicit racial bias across the law, where we begin to talk about, you know, everyone having an opportunity to understand that race still matters and to be interested in it, and a place to where we can emerge out of the social science and contribute to the discussion intellectually. Or Blind Spot, okay, by Mazarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald, which explores the hidden biases that we all carry from a lifetime of experiences based on age and gender and race and ethnicity and religion. These books, I think, are even in Audible form. I mean, that's what we're doing these days, right? But it at least will help you. Say you don't have those implicit bias trainings readily available to you right now. Some of this reading, some of this research, some of these resources could be used and provided in capacity to give you some of the information and insight that you need on this huge, huge topic. So I'm going to hand this back over to Kimberly.
Thank you, Anika. Thanks is not even, I don't even feel as if there is enough thanks to really be as appreciative as we are for what you have shared. And Shantika, really your vulnerability, sharing your experiences professionally and personally, and really kind of delving into the things that nobody wants to talk about, right? The voice, the hair, the monolith of Black people. This is our reality. And we do need to be uncomfortable. People need to be uncomfortable with hearing about this and knowing what the experiences are. So thank you so much for that. Transcending the legacy of slavery and institutional racism clearly is just, it's the deepest, most difficult kind of work. And so I really applaud, you Anika, for what you have, you and your colleagues are doing in Washington State and to the Washington Education Association. So thank you both so much. For everyone who has, we've seen a lot of raised hands in the Zoom. Please place your questions in the chat or even your comments, and we'll read them. It's not because we want to hear your voices, it's only for recording purposes. So we're going to dive into the Q&A right now and see what folks have posted. Matthew Powell has asked if there's a link for the wordage of the resolution in the NBI that could be shared to help others in crafting one for their own state.
I as I was kind of taking a look at those questions, I was texting our statewide event coordinator to see how that could be obtained. There is a representative assembly report, and I don't actually have access to that link, but if you wanted to email me as a reminder, so that I could potentially get that for you from the Education Association when it's available, I would be happy to do that. And I believe it has all of the logistics from that assembly and would have the verbiage that you are looking for.
Perfect. We'll definitely be following up with you and get these that wordage out to participants. So thank you. There's a second question that says, whenever we do the work, there's always a pushback. That pushback in my school district is 900 horsepower right now. What should we do?
I think it's hard for people to push forward when there's so much pushback. But the only way that we can continue this work is to be able to have the courage to continue pushing forward. Sometimes it takes maybe it takes one person that believes some of the same things you believe. And then maybe it takes another person to say, you know what, I didn't want to say anything, but I think that too, right? And power begins to come in numbers. But sometimes you have to find individuals who have that same belief system that you do, and that same are experiencing maybe some of the same things, and then be able to show up in numbers. Because sometimes it is hard to be the only one receiving that backlash, and maybe to appear to be the person who is, the troublemaker, right? But it's important that we continue doing that work, even as hard as it is, because if we don't, the same things will continue to happen. And sometimes that comes with more than just your voice, but with the voice of others who believe in that same belief system that you have. And I know for me, I don't necessarily have a problem talking to anyone about anything at any time. And I don't normally have to have someone to back me, but it often feels good when you do. I know in some of my trainings, I've had a lot of, I'm usually training probably 80 to 90% white educators. And when you're talking to them about how they are supposed to recognize themselves and see themselves and change some of what the systems have done, it's hard. And they don't want to hear it, they don't want to experience it. But I lead with this courageous conversation protocol that we all have to adhere to. And whenever you can't adhere to that, then we got to bring it and loop it back around. And so I would say with the district and with numbers, being able to find bodies of people who believe that same thing in order to help you continue to push forward. And I see Shantika unmuted herself, so she may have something to add.
I just wanted to add that silence equals consent. So you never want to be silent, especially when it's inside of you to like burst out, and it makes you feel uncomfortable, because once you feel uncomfortable and you know it's not right, then it's like you have to speak up, because otherwise it's gonna continue on that behavior or whatever that is going on in your district.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat. Anika, have you been successful in sharing your trainings with administrators and central office staff, as well as with teachers?
Yes, I have. I wrote a training around, because I work in HR. And so I wrote a training around hiring biases and how they're impacted by implicit bias, right? And I wrote it for a statewide event that I was going to do a training for. Well, guess what? Some of those educators were in that training and heard that. Oh, Anika wrote this curriculum, what? And it has to do exactly with what we're not doing? So then I was asked to be part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion team in the district, and was able to have conversations with that committee around what does this look like for our district. Other district superintendents are asking me to train their people. What is our district doing? And so then I had the opportunity to begin training our administrators before they conducted interviews on what does implicit bias look like, even in the hiring practices, retention practices that we have within our own district. Now, I've had to modify that to adjust for time, and I've had to do certain things, but the fact of it is, I'm glad I'm in front of these people. Because if I wasn't, then they wouldn't hear the message, right? And if you don't hear the message, then you don't have the knowledge, right? So even if I get 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or an hour, I'm going to use that to educate every single person in that room about what is and what isn't happening within the district. So yes, I've been able to do that on upper level interviews of assistant soups, as well as other administrator interviews. So yes, I've had the opportunity to do that, thankfully.
Great, thank you. I have a question because you both are very strong, educated, experienced Black women. And I think that, you know, there are a lot of folks out there, many who might be on the webinar tonight, who might be struggling with, well, what could I do as a next step? And so I want to ask you, whether they're Black, brown, or white, right? For the folks who might not be as confident or might not know what the first courageous step is, what kind of guidance would you give them to kind of start thinking about themselves as courageous and start those conversations, be they small or large?
I personally would say sometimes it takes maybe reading about what does it look like. So I've given some resources on some books and some links to access the website, taking the time to really understand what this looks like for you first. And then after you see what this looks like for you first, then maybe you can hold conversations with other people about what this looks like for them. And you don't feel so isolated in your own space, because that's hard. But you first have to recognize what you and who you are before you can begin venturing out with, you know, being bold enough maybe to have those conversations with others, maybe in this platform or any other platform. So I would say taking the time to read and learn and looking at some of the resources that are readily accessible and available to you. And then once you get a little notch under your belt with understanding, then begin to have conversations with other people. It doesn't necessarily have to be a conversation that says, do you know what implicit bias is? But it could be a conversation where you're like, you know what, I'm reading this book and it's talking about biases. And you know what, here's what I'm getting from this. What do you think? That comes off a little differently than that other approach that I just gave, and might have a different outcome that could build the culture in that environment. Shantak, I saw that you unmuted yourself.
No, you said everything that I was going to say anyway.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Yeah, it starts with you, and it doesn't have to be like a major thing. It's something small, and it has to be something that is ignited in you in order for you to find your voice first and for you to speak out secondly.
Perfect. Well, I think with that question and these answers, we really have a wealth of information to move forward. So my many thanks to both of you and to David Coleman for starting us off with the historical part. Thank you, and keep doing the good work.
To request a general session-specific certificate of completion as a participant of recorded sessions, please send your request by emailing espqweb@nea.org. All requests must include the session title and the on-screen certificate of completion code. Session certificates will not be provided if your viewer code is not included in the email request. Note, due to limitations in our ability to track attendance after live sessions, Requests for personalized certificates will only be provided for participants of live webinars whose attendance can be verified. The certificate received for viewing recorded sessions will be session specific, but will not include personalized names. On behalf of the Center of Great Public Schools, NEA's ESP Quality Department, I would like to once again thank you for our presenters for tonight's presentation, and thank you all for participating in this session. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and good night from the NEA ESP Quality Department.